The old man was freezing to death on a mountain road, barely able to stand, when an old German shepherd suddenly began barking in panic and pulled a war veteran into the storm. Headlights cut through the snow and revealed the man on the edge of collapse. Before losing consciousness, he whispered that his wife was still out there. Without hesitation, the veteran lifted him onto his back and followed the dog into the forest, unaware that what waited ahead was something the cold should never be blamed for. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support truly means the world to us. Winter lingered at the edge of the mountain town, slow and unyielding, as if it had decided to stay longer than anyone wanted it to. Michael Carter lived alone in an old log cabin at the very outskirts of town, where the paved roads surrendered to packed snow and the forest began to close in. The cabin was small and weather-beaten, its wooden walls darkened by decades of cold and wind, the roof sagging slightly under the weight of repeated winters. Michael liked it that way. The place did not pretend to be more than it was, and neither did he. At 49, Michael carried himself with the quiet solidity of a man shaped by discipline and exhaustion. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and lean, his strength earned through years of hard labor rather than comfort. His face was angular, marked by a square jaw, faint scars, and a permanent shadow of dark stubble threaded with gray. His steel-blue eyes were steady and observant, revealing little, and with most people he was polite but distant, not from unkindness, but from long habit. His days followed a strict routine. Before sunrise, he loaded his old pickup with shovels and salt, clearing steep driveways, narrow roads, and frozen sidewalks the plows reached too late. The work was hard, poorly paid, but honest, and it kept his body moving and his thoughts quiet. By late afternoon, he returned to the small garage beside his cabin to repair old vehicles no one else wanted to fix. His hands were thick and scarred, permanently stained with grease, and he charged little, only what he needed to keep food on the table and the cabin standing. Night brought a different kind of labor. Michael ate simple meals and sat by the stove until the fire burned low, but sleep never came easily. Memories from the war surfaced without warning. Heat instead of cold, dust instead of snow, voices that never finished their sentences. He spoke of those years only when pressed, and even then in careful, measured words. Silence, he had learned, was easier to carry. Buddy was always there. The German shepherd was old now, his once black and tan coat fading to gray along his back and silver around his muzzle. Large and muscular despite slower movements, he had alert amber eyes and a presence that filled the cabin. He wore no collar, followed no commands. At night he lay near the door, placing himself between Michael and the outside world. Buddy barked rarely, but when he did, there was always a reason. To Michael, the dog was not a reminder of the past, but a steady anchor to the present. In town, people knew them by sight. Michael nodded, exchanged brief greetings, and returned to work, remaining on the edges of community life. Yet beneath the routine, quiet whispers spread. Older residents who once lived alone were no longer seen after winter arrived. Explanations came easily and were accepted just as easily, because questioning them felt uncomfortable. Michael heard the rumors, noticed the dark houses and untouched paths, but kept his distance. For now, his world remained small and contained. The road, the cabin, the garage, and the silent companionship of an old dog, as winter pressed on, patient and indifferent. The storm did not announce itself. It simply arrived, swallowing the mountain road and the forest beyond it with a violence that felt personal. Wind tore through the trees in long, screaming gusts, bending trunks and snapping brittle branches, while snow fell so thick and fast it erased distance itself. The world narrowed to motion and sound, howling air, stinging ice, and the constant, crushing pressure of cold. Inside the cabin, Buddy rose. The old German shepherd had been lying near the door, his body relaxed but alert, the way it always was when Michael tried to rest. Now, every muscle drew tight beneath his thick, silver-threaded coat. His ears snapped forward, then flattened. A deep vibration gathered in his chest. Not fear, not aggression, recognition. Buddy barked once, sharp and urgent, then lunged toward the door, in claws scraping wood as if the barrier itself were an insult. Michael did not hesitate. He reached for his coat, boots, keys, movements ingrained by years of discipline and nights when hesitation cost lives. The door opened, and the storm struck him full force, stealing breath, numbing skin in seconds. Buddy surged forward into the blizzard, powerful despite his age, pulling Michael with him toward the road where white swallowed everything. The pickup's headlights cut weak tunnels through the snow, beams scattering into 1,000 spinning fragments. The road no longer existed as a thing with edges or markings, only as a direction Michael remembered with his body. Buddy ran ahead when the wind allowed, slowing when it didn't, glancing back only to make sure Michael followed. His gait was heavier than it once had been, his pace measured, but his focus was absolute. Then Buddy stopped. Not gradually, not cautiously. He halted so suddenly that Michael braked hard, the truck sliding before settling. Buddy stood rigid in the headlights, body angled toward the road's edge. His fur lifted along his spine, breath fogging the air in short, rapid bursts. His nose worked the wind, drawing in scent after scent as if reading something written invisibly in the storm. Michael stepped out and the cold cut him to the bone. That was when he saw the man. An elderly figure moved along the snow-covered road, barely upright, each step uncertain and slow, as if gravity itself were pulling him down. He was tall once, Michael guessed, but age and exhaustion had folded him inward. His coat was thin, far too thin, its fabric soaked and dark, offering little protection against the cold. One shoulder sagged lower than the other, and his boots left uneven tracks, one foot dragging slightly behind. His hands were bare. They shook uncontrollably, fingers stiff and curled, skin pale and mottled from the cold. His hair was white and sparse, plastered flat against his head by snow, and his beard was uneven, tipped with frost. When the headlights struck his face, he lifted his head with visible effort, eyes glassy but painfully aware. Michael closed the distance in seconds, catching the man as his knees buckled. Up close, the signs were unmistakable. Shallow breathing. Lips cracked and blue. A small cut near the temple, stiff with ice. His body trembled violently, no longer able to regulate itself. Hypothermia already advanced. "Easy," Michael said, voice low and steady, anchoring both of them against the wind. The man tried to speak. His mouth opened, closed. Words fought their way up through frozen breath. His eyes searched Michael's face with a desperate focus that had nothing to do with himself. "My wife," he whispered. The sentence broke apart in the air. "She stayed." The effort cost him everything. His grip slackened, fingers slipping from Michael's sleeve as his strength gave out. His eyes rolled back slightly, focus fading. Buddy stepped in close, pressing his broad body against the old man's leg, sharing warmth, standing guard. His amber eyes never left the man's face. His nose lifted again, drawing in the storm, ears twitching as if something, fear, panic, urgency, still lingered nearby, fresh and sharp. The old man's breath hitched. "Please," he murmured, barely audible beneath the wind. "Don't." The rest never came. His body sagged fully now, weight heavy and unresisting in Michael's arms. The storm roared on, indifferent, snow piling around their boots, erasing the fragile tracks the man had left behind. Michael held him there for a moment, feeling how light he was, how close to disappearing. Buddy stood at his side, fur bristling, nose still working the air, as if the fear had not ended here, only paused. Somewhere in the white darkness beyond the headlights, someone else had been left behind, and the night showed no sign of mercy. Buddy did not hesitate after the old man's words faded into the storm. The German shepherd turned from the road and moved straight into the forest, nose low, body tense, each step deliberate despite the deepening snow. Michael followed, carrying the elderly man against his chest, the weight uneven and fragile, breath shallow against his shoulder. The forest swallowed them quickly. Trees crowded in from every side, their trunks dark and silent, branches heavy with snow that fell in soft collapses as the wind pushed through. There was no path, no marker, only Buddy's steady forward pull and the quiet certainty in his movements that this was not wandering, but return. The shack emerged not as shelter, but as a mistake made solid. It stood in a bare clearing where the trees had been pushed back just enough to expose it to every direction of wind. Straw formed its roof in a hurried, uneven layer, sagging inward as if exhausted by its own effort to hold. Torn sheets of plastic tarp hung loose along the sides, edges stiff and shredded, snapping weakly in the cold. Gaps yawned between warped wooden supports, letting icy air pass freely through the structure. Snow had drifted inside, settling along the floor in the corners as if claiming the space without resistance. Nothing about the place suggested care. Everything about it suggested speed. Inside, the cold was immediate and absolute. A rough wooden bed frame occupied the far side of the shack, its surface splintered and unfinished, built to hold weight but not comfort. On it lay an elderly woman. Small and painfully thin, her body curled inward as if trying to make itself smaller against the cold. Her legs were loosely bound to the frame with rope. Knots simple, functional, not cruel but unthinking. Her clothes were layered but insufficient, fabric thin and worn, unable to trap warmth anymore. Her hands trembled uncontrollably at her sides, skin pale and tight over bone. She lifted her head with effort when Michael entered, eyes clouded but aware. Her hair was mostly silver, pulled back in a loose braid that had been done carefully, habit rather than vanity. Her face was narrow, cheekbones sharp beneath stretched skin, lips dry and faintly blue. When she spoke, her voice was little more than breath, but her words were clear. "He said it was only temporary," she whispered. "Just a few days." There was no accusation in her tone, and only quiet confusion, as if she were still trying to understand how a promise could dissolve so completely. Buddy moved to her side without command, standing close, his body angled protectively between her and the open gaps in the wall. Michael set the old man down gently, his attention drawn not to what had been taken from this place, but to what had been left. There were no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, no scattered belongings. A small bag sat beneath the bed, carefully tucked away, holding papers wrapped in cloth to keep them dry. A single bottle, empty, lay near the wall. The rope showed no signs of having been tightened or pulled in anger. This was not violence in the familiar sense. It was something quieter, colder, absence instead of force. The wind pushed through the shack again, rattling the tarp, and sending a fresh wave of cold across the woman's body. She shuddered, but did not cry out. Her eyes stayed fixed on the old man, searching his face as if confirming that he was still real, still there. Michael stood where he was, the weight of the scene pressing down on him. He had seen abandonment before, dressed in different uniforms, spoken in different languages, but it always carried the same shape. Someone had decided that survival was inconvenient. Someone had decided that winter would finish what they did not want to do themselves. For a long moment, Michael did nothing. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply took in the details. The placement of the shack, the lack of outgoing tracks, the fragile effort at shelter that was never meant to last. Understanding settled slowly but firmly in his chest. This was not an accident. This was not misjudgment. It was a decision, deliberate and final, made far from this clearing by someone who believed distance could erase responsibility. Michael exhaled once, long and controlled, and in that breath, The truth became unavoidable. The cold was not the most dangerous thing here. It was human choice. The storm finished what it had begun. By the time Michael tried the radio again, the static was complete. A flat, meaningless hiss that swallowed every attempt at contact. The road beyond the trees no longer existed as a passage, only a buried idea beneath drifting snow. Even if help were moving somewhere beyond the forest, it would not reach this clearing tonight. Michael accepted the truth without argument. Experience had taught him that denial wasted energy, and energy was the only currency left. He set the radio aside, turned back to the shack, and understood that the night was no longer something to endure. It was something to manage. He worked with what the forest allowed. Branches snapped from nearby trees were wedged against the windward side of the shack, pressed into place and packed with snow to blunt the worst gusts. And he pulled the torn tarp tighter, reinforcing weak knots, then used his old military jacket, faded, heavy, and patched from years of use, to seal the largest opening where the wind cut straight through. The jacket carried the faint smell of oil and smoke, a relic from another life, but it held. Each movement was slow and deliberate, measured not by speed but by efficiency. Inside, the temperature did not rise, but it stopped falling, and that was enough to keep hope alive. The fire was a compromise. The wood was damp, unwilling, and the flame that caught was small and unsteady, more glow than blaze. Michael fed it patiently, shielding it with his hands until it found a rhythm of its own. The light revealed the lines in Harold's face more clearly now, deep grooves carved by years of work and worry. His beard rimmed with frost where breath still escaped unevenly. Evelyn lay rigid beneath borrowed layers, her chest rising shallowly, eyes half open, tracking movement without speaking. Michael divided the remaining food with care, breaking pieces smaller than instinct suggested and handing them over without ceremony. No one protested. Hunger had become secondary to warmth. Buddy took his position without instruction. He lay directly in front of the shack's entrance, broad body stretched across the threshold back to the fire, face to the storm. His fur lifted and settled with each breath, snow melting into the thick coat along his spine. He did not sleep, not once. His ears twitched at every change in wind, every distant crack of branches under ice. From time to time his nose lifted, drawing in the night as if measuring it, and then lowered again. He was a barrier, simple, living, absolute. Michael noticed how Evelyn's breathing eased whenever the dog shifted closer to the door, as if his presence alone altered the shape of fear. As the hours dragged on, the wind found its voice again, forcing memories to the surface. Michael sat with his back to the wall, knees drawn up, hands wrapped around cooling metal, and the forest dissolved into another place. Heat instead of cold. Dust instead of snow. The sound of retreat pressed into his skull, the order that came too late, the split second where choice narrowed to survival. He saw it again, a figure half hidden by smoke, a hand reaching then vanishing as Michael turned because he had been told to. He had lived because of that decision. The weight of it had never lifted. The storm outside howled, and the echo of that moment followed it, reminding him why leaving now was not an option. He stayed awake through the worst of the night, checking pulses, counting breaths, adjusting layers when shivering returned. The fire sank lower, then steadied again. Harold stirred once, murmured Evelyn's name, and fell quiet. Evelyn reached out weakly, fingers brushing the rough wood beside her, grounding herself in the present. Michael did not speak much. Words felt unnecessary and thin. What mattered was constancy, the unbroken line of attention that told two fragile bodies they had not been forgotten. By the time the wind eased into a dull, exhausted moan, the storm had taken everything it could from the clearing. Snow continued to fall, but more gently now, settling over branches and roof alike. Michael remained where he was, eyes open, his posture unchanged. He understood the shape of the promise he was making. Not aloud, not dramatically, but in the only language that mattered. He would not turn away. Not tonight. Not again. And as Buddy held the door and the fire clung to life, the night passed, not conquered, but endured. Firelight changed the shack without truly warming it. The flame Michael had coaxed into being flickered low and uneven, throwing long shadows that stretched and collapsed across the straw walls. In that thin circle of light, the woman began to speak. Not loudly, not all at once, but in fragments shaped by memory rather than time. Her voice was still weak, yet steadier now, and when she talked she kept her eyes on the fire as if it were easier to face the past through something that burned and survived. She spoke of a small house they once owned, modest and plain, but theirs. She described the day they sold it to help their son pay off debts that had grown faster than hope, believing the sacrifice would buy peace for the family. The words carried no bitterness, in only the quiet logic of parents who believed love was a currency that never failed. When she paused, the fire snapped softly, as if acknowledging the cost. She described the months that followed, how they told themselves the loss of the house was temporary, how they moved from place to place with the careful gratitude of people who did not want to be a burden. She spoke of promises made gently, of reassurances delivered with practiced smiles, and of the final trip that brought them here. "Just to rest," she said, almost apologetically, "just until things were better." Her hands trembled as she spoke, thin fingers curling inward against the cold, but her gaze remained clear. This was not a woman confused by age. This was a woman trying to reconcile trust with consequence. Outside, the wind sighed through the gaps in the shack, punctuating her story with a sound that felt uncomfortably like agreement. Michael listened without interruption. He did not ask questions, did not press for names or timelines. His posture was still, shoulders relaxed but alert, the way they had been on nights when talking mattered more than action. When she finished, he waited a beat longer than politeness required, as if measuring the space her words had left behind. "You weren't wrong to love," he said at last, voice slow and even, spoken as much to himself as to her. "You didn't fail by giving." There was no judgment in the statement, no promise of justice, only recognition. In the firelight, his face showed the lines of a man who had learned that anger burned hot and fast, while understanding endured. Buddy moved then, careful and deliberate. Yet the old German shepherd rose from his place near the door and padded across the packed earth, nails clicking softly against wood. He lowered himself beside the bed frame and rested his broad head on the woman's hand, the warmth of his body seeping through layers of worn fabric. His coat, thick and grayed along the spine, carried the faint scent of smoke and snow. He was 7 now, slower in his movements, but his presence filled the space with something solid and unarguable. The woman's breath hitched, and for the first time since Michael had found them, she cried, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet release of someone who had held herself together because there had been no other choice. Buddy did not move. He simply stayed, eyes half closed, lending heat and weight until the shaking eased. While the fire held, Michael turned his attention outward. He did not make a show of it. He simply observed, the way he always had when truth hid in ordinary places. He noticed the rope again, its fibers worn smooth by use, the knot simple, functional, tied by someone in a hurry rather than someone cruel. He took note of the papers tucked beneath the mattress, wrapped in cloth to keep them dry, identification, folded letters, documents that spoke quietly of ownership and obligation. He stepped outside briefly, marking the pattern of footprints in the snow, how they approached the shack and did not leave, how the depth and spacing suggested calm movement rather than struggle. Each detail settled into place, not as evidence yet, but as understanding. Stories left shapes. Shapes could be followed. Inside, the woman's crying subsided into slow, careful breaths. She stroked Buddy's head with unsteady fingers, tracing the line where black fur gave way to silver. "He's kind," she said softly, as if kindness were something that could be exhausted. Michael nodded once. Kindness, he knew, survived by being practiced, not preserved. He fed the fire again, splitting the last pieces of food into smaller portions and passing them over without comment. Hunger, like fear, had learned to wait. The night stretched on, quieter now, the storm's voice reduced to a tired murmur. Michael remained awake, collecting nothing more than what was already there. Facts, textures, truths, while keeping watch. He did not rush. There would be time later for questions and consequences. For now, the work was simpler and harder at once, to witness without judgment, to hold space without promises, to let survival be enough. As the fire sank lower and the woman's breathing steadied, Michael understood what she had not yet said aloud, and what he would not force her to say. Living sometimes did not mean moving forward. Sometimes it meant standing still long enough for the truth to catch up. Morning arrived without warmth, but with clarity. The storm had spent itself in the night, leaving behind a hard, brittle silence that rang beneath every step. Snow still covered the clearing, but its violence had softened into something readable. Tracks, edges, distances returning to the world. Michael rose with the light, joints stiff, eyes clear, and helped Harold to his feet, steadying him until the old man found his balance. Evelyn followed more slowly, wrapped in borrowed layers, her posture fragile but composed. Buddy moved close, 7 years old and graying along the muzzle, his broad shoulders dusted with snow, placing himself where he could lend warmth and reassurance without crowding. They left the straw shack behind exactly as it was, untouched by drama, its purpose fulfilled and its truth preserved. The walk back to town was careful and quiet. Michael chose the route with intention, avoiding drifts where the crust would give way, setting a pace that matched Harold's uneven steps and Evelyn's measured breathing. The forest thinned as they descended, trees pulling back to reveal the road that now existed again, not friendly, but passable. When the first rooftops came into view, smoke rising thinly into the pale sky, Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, as if to confirm the sight was real. Michael said nothing. He had learned that some thresholds were crossed without words. At the edge of town, help did not arrive as spectacle. It arrived as recognition. Mrs. Klein, the town clerk, stood on the steps of the municipal building with a clipboard tucked against her coat. A compact woman in her late 50s whose iron-gray hair was always pinned neatly back and whose voice carried farther than it needed to. She had the habit of listening twice before speaking once, a skill honed by decades of sorting truth from convenience. Beside her waited Deputy Tom Reyes, early 40s, lean and angular, his beard trimmed close, eyes tired but attentive. He had grown quieter after a line-of-duty accident years earlier had cost him a partner. Since then, he treated every small detail like a promise. Michael handed over what he had kept, the documents wrapped in cloth, the rope, a careful description of tracks and placement, without ceremony, without accusation. He spoke plainly. Mrs. Klein wrote steadily. Reyes nodded and asked questions that showed he already understood where the answers would lead. Yet the picture assembled itself quickly because it had been assembling for months. Other names surfaced, then faces. An elderly man who had moved to stay with family but never arrived. A woman whose house had been sold abruptly, proceeds redirected, her insurance updated the same week. Statements came in quietly, often haltingly, as people realized their stories fit a pattern larger than themselves. The phrase used to justify it, care, appeared again and again, clean and convincing on paper. Michael listened from the back of the room, arms folded, Buddy at his feet, noting how often relief followed confession. No one wanted to be first. Everyone wanted to be heard once it was safe. There were no raised voices when the truth was acknowledged. No dramatic arrests in the street. Procedures moved at the speed they needed to move. Mrs. Klein sealed folders, Deputy Reyes made calls. A social worker arrived, young and pale with winter, her hair pulled into a practical knot, eyes earnest as she spoke gently with Evelyn and Harold about next steps. Michael answered when addressed and otherwise stayed still. He had not come to be thanked. He had come because leaving would have been easier, and he had learned too well what easy choices cost. By midday, the town had shifted. It was subtle, the way people held doors longer, the way eyes met Michael's and did not slide away. He noticed it in the hardware store window reflection, in the pause before a nod became a greeting. For years he had been the quiet man on the outskirts, useful and distant, a veteran whose past made him easier to avoid than to know. Now, trust did not arrive as praise. It arrived as expectation. And someone asked if he could help fix a railing at the community center. Someone else asked if Buddy liked children. Michael agreed to the first and smiled at the second, a small change that did not go unnoticed. When evening came, Michael walked Evelyn and Harold to temporary lodging arranged without fuss. Evelyn thanked him once, simply, her voice steadier than it had been in days. Harold squeezed Michael's arm, the pressure weak but deliberate. Buddy accepted their gratitude with quiet dignity, tail tapping once against the floor. Outside, the cold returned as a fact rather than a threat. Michael stood for a moment on the sidewalk, breath visible, and understood the shape of what had happened. He had not saved the town. He had not redeemed it. He had chosen not to turn away, and that choice had made room for others to do the same. And in the clean light after the storm, the truth had not shouted. It had stood and been seen. The straw shack did not survive the spring. When the snow finally loosened its grip and the ground thawed enough to remember its own shape, the town dismantled the shelter piece by piece, careful not to dramatize what had already been understood. Straw was lifted away, rope untied, warped boards stacked aside. The clearing returned to dirt and roots, an ordinary patch of forest made honest again. In its place, closer to town and closer to help, a small winter refuge rose with quiet intent. It was simple. Wooden walls, tight seams, steady heat, but it carried a rule that mattered more than construction. No one would be asked why they were there. Doors would open without interrogation. Warmth would be given without accounting. The building did not announce itself as charity. It stood as a choice the town had finally agreed to make. That Michael took the work because it needed doing. He did not frame it as service or redemption. He showed up with tools that bore the marks of long use, hands that understood grain and torque, and a habit of fixing what failed before it failed again. He mended hinges, replaced cracked panes, reinforced steps that would see many winters. He learned the building's quiet language, the hum of the heater when it ran clean, the rattle that meant a vent needed clearing, the soft knock of pipes settling at night. It was modest labor, poorly named if called heroic, but it anchored him. For the first time in years, he measured days not by what he avoided, but by what he maintained. Buddy adapted without ceremony. 7 years old now, the German Shepherd moved slower, favoring his back leg when the cold pressed hard, his once black muzzle silvered with age. His coat remained thick, his eyes still amber and alert. Each morning, he took up a position on the porch as if it were an assignment he had accepted long ago. He watched the path, head high, ears turning with the wind. Children learned quickly to greet him calmly. Adults learned to trust his stillness. He did not bark unless there was reason. When he lay down, it was with the assurance of a guard who knew exactly what he was guarding. People arrived in twos and ones, not in waves. An elderly man whose furnace had failed and whose pride had lasted longer than his savings. A woman with hands rough from work and eyes tired from nights spent listening for footsteps that never came. A quiet couple who carried their belongings in a single bag and spoke only when spoken to. Michael did not ask for histories. He showed them where to put coats, where soup waited, where sleep would come without bargaining. When repairs were needed, a loose rail, a door that stuck, he fixed them before anyone had to ask. The building began to feel less like shelter and more like pause, a place where breath could slow enough to find its rhythm again. Trust followed practice. The town's nods turned into expectations, not burdensome, but shared. Someone left fresh bread on the counter without comment. Someone else dropped off spare blankets, folded cleanly, no note attached. Michael noticed the change in himself before he named it. He spoke more. He listened longer. He stopped flinching when voices rose, stopped scanning rooms for exits that were no longer required. At night, when the building settled and the heater ticked into its steady hum, he sat by the door with Buddy at his feet and felt the unfamiliar ease of being necessary for reasons that did not involve crisis. The refuge did not erase what had happened. It gave it a boundary. The story of the shack became instruction rather than wound. Procedures were written, neighbors trained, contacts posted where anyone could see them. There were no speeches to mark the change. There were fewer sirens in winter. That was enough. Michael did not claim credit, and no one pressed it on him. They understood, perhaps without saying it, that the most durable changes rarely announced themselves. They arrived the way spring did in the mountains. Slowly, unevenly, unmistakably. One morning, as the frost lifted early and the light lingered, Michael paused on the porch and watched Buddy settle into his familiar stance. The dog's breathing was slower now, his movements heavier, but the habit held. Guarding was not something he did, it was who he was. Michael felt the echo of that truth in himself. He had spent years moving through life as if passing through were the safest option. Now, staying felt less like risk and more like alignment. He had not been saved by the town. He had helped build a place where saving was no longer a singular act. When evening came, Michael locked up, checked the heat, and stood for a moment in the quiet. The building behind him held warmth and ordinary sounds, the clink of a mug, the low murmur of conversation, a laugh that surprised itself. Buddy leaned into his leg, steady and familiar. Michael rested a hand on the dog's head and let the day end without rehearsal. Staying, he understood at last, was not surrender. It was a decision, renewed each morning, to be present where presence mattered. And for the first time in a long while, he chose it without hesitation. Not every miracle arrives with thunder or fire from the sky. Some miracles come quietly, through a stranger who stops when it would be easier to keep driving, through a door that opens without questions, through a heart that chooses compassion over comfort. Michael did not perform a miracle. He did not heal the world. He simply refused to turn away. And sometimes that is how God works, not through grand signs, but through ordinary people who listen when their conscience speaks. In our daily lives, we pass moments like this more often than we realize. A neighbor who needs checking on, a stranger who needs patience instead of judgment, a choice between indifference and kindness. We may never know which small act becomes someone else's answered prayer. If this story touched your heart, and perhaps it is because somewhere, right now, someone is waiting for the same mercy you once needed, or still do. Maybe you are meant to be that quiet miracle in their life. May God watch over you. May He protect those who feel forgotten, abandoned, or afraid. And may He remind us that even in the coldest seasons, we are never truly alone. If you believe in compassion, second chances, and quiet miracles, please share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment. Your words might reach a heart that feels unseen. And subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories that remind us what it means to care, to stay, and to choose love when it matters most. God bless you.